Okay, let's get started. Let's begin. Welcome to the University of Tennessee Nuclear Engineering Department Colloquium Program. My name is Lee Dodds, and it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, who is Mr. Alex Fischer, who is the Director for Technology Transfer and Economic Development with the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Alex has had an interesting career, beginning with, he's a two-time graduate of UT, received a BS in 1989 in economics, and then an MS in planning in 1991, and then he went to work for the Tennessee Technology Foundation. He was there a couple of years until he founded what is called Technology 2020. He was the founder of that in '93. He worked there for 4 years, and that organization still exists and is very active. And then in 1997, he became the Commissioner for Economic Development for the state of Tennessee. And then in the year 2001, this really gets interesting, he was the Deputy Governor for the state of Tennessee. And as you see in a moment, Alex is quite young, and as it turns out, he was the youngest deputy governor of any state in the Union at that point in time. He was in his early 30s. He says, when he told me that, I said, well, you're a politician. And he said, yeah, I'm a snake oil salesman. And so in the year 2002 and up till the present, he's been with UT Battelle Corporation in his current role as the Director for Technology Transfer and Economic Development. Of course, UT Battelle is the prime contractor for the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So the topic of his presentation today, as you might suspect, is technology transfer and economic development. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Alex Fischer.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I hope that we can talk a little bit about the technology transfer, a little bit about the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and our relationship with the University of Tennessee and the Battelle Memorial Institute. And I hope we'll have an opportunity to have a little bit of a dialogue about what technology transfer can mean, not only for a laboratory and a university, but from a community and new companies and entrepreneurialism. I'm going to tell a little story as I start on myself. There's a little bit of a joke at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory about my pronunciation of the word nuclear. And I have quit trying to figure out how you actually say it. I've gone through some different areas of practice.
We can help.
But Frank Munger, who is a local reporter for the Knoxville News Sentinel and covers the Oak Ridge beat, did a story a few months ago after President Bush had been to the laboratory, and he started off in chiding the president for his pronunciation, as you can see, of nuclear, and he made the comment that anybody has the opportunity to detonate a bomb ought to be able to pronounce it, and then he went on to opine that he heard me botched the word on several occasions, and that he thought perhaps, given my political affiliations, it was some type of a Republican thing, but he hearkened back to Jimmy Carter, the Democrat, who, according to Frank Munger, couldn't say it as well. And then our CEO from the Battelle side of the equation did an interview with him, and Carl Court, our CEO, botched it as well. So perhaps I'm at least in good company within our company, but when I knew I was coming over to do this, I thought, I don't get nervous about speeches, but the word nuclear does cause me stumbling block. So perhaps afterwards you all could give me a little bit of a help in pronunciation. Technology transfer, and I'll talk about tech transfer and commercialization really interchangeably. I have found, if you look across universities and if you look across laboratories, starts with a culture at the bottom, but also starts with a culture at the top. And I'm real fortunate that the culture at the top of our organization is one that is very strong from a commercialization standpoint. Jeff Wadsworth, who's the director of the National Laboratory, was the deputy director for a number of years at Lawrence Livermore National Lab out in California. Jeff started at the Lawrence Livermore in my job. Now, I don't think there's much opportunity for a non-scientist like myself to follow his career path, but he set up the office at Lawrence Livermore, which is known as a very successful commercialization unit. And so when Jeff came in a little over a year ago, I went in to meet with him. He immediately understood the vernacular that we would talk about in terms of licensing and intellectual property and the need to protect it, and the challenges that can come with it, the negative publicity that can come with it on occasion. Jeff tells a great story about finding himself on the cover of USA Today after a small business licensee had cried foul to Congress on an act that they had done and found themselves in a major hubbub with the Department of Energy, and Jeff found himself right there in the middle of it. But so when I've gone to Jeff Wadsworth and said, we need to make sure that we protect our intellectual property with a steel sword, being a metallurgist, he understands the difference of a steel sword and a rubber sword. And sometimes with a steel sword, you've got to go out and protect your intellectual property, be willing to file suit against people who are infringing, take challenges that sometimes our Department of Energy customer doesn't like. And it's great to have somebody at the top of our organization who understands and respects that. Our vice chair of our board, Dr. Peterson, who is new on board, we're thrilled of his engagement to date, both in the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in particular, but more specifically in the field of commercialization, and the way he wants to roll up his sleeves and understand how we use that partnership for economic development benefits, and how to build both the university enterprise and OR&L from a commercialization standpoint. We work real well with Fred Tompkins, who's here. So we've got great support from that standpoint. We've also got great support over in our parent company. In a few minutes, I'll tell you a little bit more about the other half of our parent that some may not know as much about, and that's the Battelle Memorial Institute, who is in joint partnership with the University of Tennessee. But we have very strong support there in an organization that has strong commercialization roots. The Department of Energy, Ray Orbach, who is the head of the Office of Science in Washington, and Gerald Boyd, again, are individuals that are engaging one-on-one with me on a regular basis, which is sometimes unusual for people in their roles, but they have a passion for this area we call commercialization, and how we use the laboratory and benefit with the laboratory broadly from a community. And then we've seen the state of Tennessee engage over the last 4 years, and I was proud to be a part of it when the UT Battelle team was put together, and I was in Nashville. The state's invested or committed over $26 million in terms of physical facilities to the University of Tennessee that are located in Oak Ridge. And if you'll recall, in the early days of those commitments, it was at a time that I was standing up before reporters and having to announce that we were closing state parks, and we were in the middle of unbelievable budget battles. And so to see the state then fighting those, and now to have a physicist who's a governor who understands the importance of science and engineering and what it can mean to our economy to continue that, in my world, I think it is a tremendous asset, again, to have people at the tops of organizations that appreciate what we do. I would also suggest to you that it's an opportunity for Fred Tompkins and this university, my university, to continue to try to aspire and push the envelope to do even more in the area of commercialization than perhaps has been done in the past. Let me talk for a moment about the partnership that is the University of Tennessee and the Battelle organization, and suggest to you why this partnership is unique from a technology transfer perspective that perhaps other contractors in the Department of Energy world weren't. If you go back in history, the two longest-running contractors in Oak Ridge were Union Carbide, and then later Lockheed Martin, first Martin Marietta, and then Lockheed Martin throughout much of the 90s, and then Union Carbide in the 70s and much of the early 80s were the contractors in Oak Ridge. Those are two large private companies who have private agendas, publicly traded companies that have stockholders to answer to, that when they make a profit, they do the normal thing that you would expect them to do with those profits. They pour them back into other profitable ventures, but then ultimately are making distributions to owners of those companies and the shareholders of those companies. In the commercialization world, we're a Department of Energy facility. All of our intellectual property is funded for the most part by the federal government. So when you have a private contractor that is there managing the federal government's intellectual property, there are obvious rules and regulations about what those companies can do with those. And as a general rule, they manage them without a whole lot of a profit motivation, without a whole lot of a corporate motivation to do a lot. So you found Union Carbide and Lockheed Martin less interested in the commercialization world than you find UT Patel. One of the reasons that you find that is because UT Patel is a not-for-profit organization. We're not a for-profit organization. We're the combination of the University of Tennessee, which you all know better than anybody, a land-grant institution, and a land-grant institution meaning how does an institution provide economic benefit at its earliest days in the agricultural arena in the state of Tennessee, but now in the modern economy across so many different ways. How do we use a land-grant institution to improve the economy, number one. Number two, combined with the Patel organization. Most don't realize that Patel is also a not-for-profit organization. Battelle was created in 1929 by the untimely death of Gordon Battelle. Gordon Battelle was in the steel industry. In some ways, his family's steel industry were riding the wave of the times as robber barons, as some might call them, providing steel to the railroad enterprises that were being built around the country and making lots of money doing it. When Gordon Battelle died, he actually died at a very young age on the operating table, having inherited the company from his father. He died from an appendix surgery. They opened his will. He was a bachelor. Opened his will, and he gave the Battelle enterprise to create the Battelle Memorial Institute. The value of that was about $1 million, which in pre-crash of 1929 was a lot of money. There many of us had done the calculation what it might have looked like had the 1929 stock market not crashed. But nonetheless, that $1 million endowment was given with the stated purpose to further the purposes of mankind through research and development and education of men and women. And it's interesting that in the 1900s, when he was writing that will, he bothered to put the education of both men and women. I do a corporate meeting at least once a month with Battelle, and never have I been in a corporate meeting in which we don't talk about the core purpose of that will and are we staying true to the will of Gordon Battelle. So what has happened since 1929 with the Battelle organization? It's now a $3.7 billion enterprise, so that's a pretty good growth rate from $1 million investment in a not-for-profit organization. One of the things that happened was a guy named Chester Carlston, who brought an invention disclosure to Battelle, that the Battelle group of people got together, did an analysis on it, made the determination that there probably wasn't a large market for this product that he was promoting called the xerography process, but nonetheless said, despite the fact that we think the only application is perhaps copying all the books in the Library of Congress, we're going to give you a little bit of seed money to continue. And obviously that led to the formation of the Xerox Corporation, and the Battelle organization divested itself, having been the largest shareholder of Xerox in 1965, helped us to build a large portfolio to do many, many things early on. I tell you that story to say that that's a commercialization story. From the earliest days of the Battelle organization, Battelle's been interested in commercialization. It saw what it could do for all of its other lines of business. It saw what it could do in furthering the purposes of mankind through research and development. If you go to Kroger this afternoon and scan a barcode scanner, that's a Battelle licensed and developed technology. If you put a CD music ROM in your car on your drive home today, that's a Battelle licensed technology and developed technology. If you decide to mow the yard and get your weed eater out, the distribution on the weed eater trim is a Battelle developed technology. Battelle has a long and varied history from drug discovery and drug applications. If you go and get the the spray that will go to help asthma treatments. That's a drug delivery system that's developed by Battelle. So the Battelle organization has a long history of commercialization. It's a not-for-profit. When the University of Tennessee was trying to decide who to partner with, they thought that Battelle was the right partner, a choice that I think now, in hindsight, has been proven to be a great choice for the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So what's it mean for commercialization? We as a not-for-profit, under Bayh-Dole rights, which are federal laws that govern federally funded research and development, can take ownership to the intellectual property. We can take ownership in the commercialization efforts, unlike a Lockheed Martin and a Union Carbide. That gives us a much more of a motivation to do commercial activity. Now, people immediately say, well, what do you do with the profits when you make them? Well, not-for-profit, both the University of Tennessee and Battelle, we pour them all back into the laboratory. There's no motivation to give it out to stockholders because we have no stockholders. And so we consider the stockholders the communities in which we operate and the laboratories in which we manage. So a little longer-winded explanation as to UT, Battelle, and why I think it's unique from a commercialization standpoint to give you context for why I think the future looks very differently than the past might have looked over the last 60 years at the Oak Ridge National Lab as it relates to commercial opportunity. We've got a long and cherished history that I won't go through at the Laboratory of Science and Technology. I sometimes wonder, what if in the 40s and 50s, guys from the private sector like myself were engaged in trying to understand how to exploit, and some people think that word exploit's a dangerous word, but how to exploit for a profit, and I've told you what we do with those profits, we reinvest them, the science and technology developments that are coming out of the lab. We saw, I'm going to make one point, I said I'm supposed to draw on the board, that Oak Ridge was some of the founding principles of nuclear medicine, and you all would know this better than I, got their roots at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. My question from a commercialization standpoint would be, what have we gotten in return for all of the early foundation research and development that the Oak Ridge National Laboratory was doing in nuclear medicine? And the answer, quite frankly, is not much, because we weren't engaged in active commercialization alongside our research and development days in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s. But imagine what the opportunities could have looked like. We've got a wonderful company here in Knoxville, Tennessee, CTI, which everybody is aware of, and the relationships of the founders of that company to the University of Tennessee and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. A great economic development success story. I hope we have many more CTIs in the future, and when we do, I hope that the University of Tennessee and the Oak Ridge National Lab are in a position for protected intellectual property that are allowing our institutions as well as our community to gain from those. So when I look to the future of our laboratory, and we're on the cutting edge of a great future with investments in spallation neutron source, with investments in the world's largest supercomputer, and investments in our biology program, I think to be on the cutting edge of science and technology for the next 60 years. And unique is that we have a very aggressive commercialization group that's standing side by side with our research staff in an appropriate way, not trying to direct research, but trying to catch those ideas and think about them from a private marketplace. Alvin Weinberg was one of the more famous laboratory directors, and he described the National Lab in a couple of ways that I wanted to highlight for you, and the last being a way that I think has a particular relevance to the challenge of commercialization. A powerful instrument of technology, scientific, and social progress. That idea of social progress, I think, is very important to the world of commercialization. How do we begin to take the worlds and discoveries and the work that everybody in this room are working on and begin to move them very aggressively to real-world applications that are affecting citizens throughout our country and throughout the world? That's how you make social progress, or one way that you can make social progress. A unique combination of mission orientation and discipline orientation. We never can lose sight of the reason there is an Oak Ridge National Laboratory. a guy like me should never be allowed to move an organization away from its core mission. That core mission is to do science and technology for our federal government and for our nation, and in many aspects our world, to make sure that we're doing cutting-edge science and technology for breakthrough activities. We can't lose sight of that mission, but I would suggest to you that his final challenge was a flair for getting after very big and difficult matters has relevance to commercialization in this context. That you can do science and technology at the cutting edge, the things that you all are doing in your laboratories every day, and stand next to guys like me and folks in the private sector, a challenge. That's a flair for trying to do things differently. It's a flair for trying to do things bigger than perhaps we've done them before, but I think one that if we develop a mutual respect for each other's work and opportunities, then one that can be very powerful for our laboratory. So why do we do technology transfer? I summarize it in three ways. First is to further the research and development agenda. Now, I'm going to give you a premise, and I'd love to debate it and hear your thoughts on it, but I believe that researchers are stronger when they've got the private sector know-how and knowledge of what private markets are saying about that research and development standing next to them in laboratories. Sometimes that can happen at the earliest stages, other times that happens at later stages in the research and development process. I'll give you an example of the picture here is a license that will be consummated with the Secretary of Energy in a couple of weeks called Second Sight. It's an ability to take retina visualization technology developed at the Oak Ridge National Lab and Oregon National Lab in a way that is literally beginning to bring sight to blind folks. The ability to drive that technology to the next level are tens of millions of dollars that a private sector partner is willing to bring into our laboratory that will help us, I believe, over the next 20 years, make the generational kinds of improvements to that technology that otherwise we've been unsuccessful in finding funders to be able to do. They'll be doing it alongside Department of Energy researchers and developers, but it offers us a great opportunity to bring private monies and private know-how and knowledge to be put alongside that know-how and knowledge that we have that I think can help drive the research and development agenda. Secondly, I think it helps us to refresh our laboratory. How? By making sure that we focus on making a profit and reinvesting those profits back into our laboratory. As we make money in our commercialization operations, we reinvest those monies back into the very laboratories, facilities, people, equipment that generated the intellectual property to begin with. So it offers us in tight budget times. You all have it here at the University of Tennessee, and it's not likely to change here in the state of Tennessee. Budgets are always tight. Funding sources are always tight. Commercialization offers us opportunities to go out and expand those. And then finally, economic development. And I put CTI on this particular slide because I think it has great relevance to the 1,000 people that are working on the Pellissippi Parkway that got their start because of ideas and researchers that came out of this facility in the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, making our community a dramatically better place. I believe that's a great combination of furthering the R&D agenda, of refreshing the laboratory, and promoting economic development that should get us excited about. But there are always issues, and I pulled this slide from a slide and stole it from a slide of MIT presentation about something that always comes up in our world of commercialization, and that is the struggle between publication and going public with knowledge and information that's being discovered and that in which you protect. And I found it interesting how MIT positions themselves to say the mission of their university is to produce knowledge and provide it to the public, and they don't apologize for it. They put it right in the face of guys like myself, and in fact, this is a slide off of the Tech Transfer's office at MIT. The right and freedom to publish is more important in an academic setting than financial goals. That would suggest that we never should put the profit motive, even if that profit motive is one that wants to reinvest in the laboratory, ahead of the mission of the organization. Think back to Alvin Weinberg's quote of mission orientation. And I believe, as just a philosophy, that's right on target. And another philosophy at MIT that I share, and that is that you can't take faculty, or in our instance, PIs and researchers, can't delay the publications of results based on the needs of a startup company or based on the needs of a licensee. It's not our business to determine whether or not something should be published. It is our business, however, to suggest how we make sure that we've got legal protection when things are being published. I'm not suggesting that we go and publish without making sure that we do everything from a legal standpoint. That requires great coordination. I found those as three interesting points recently in looking at MIT's program, which is undoubtedly the most successful university-based commercialization program anywhere in the country, relevant not only to your university setting, but very relevant to our setting at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. We're building a very robust commercialization group. It centers around technology portfolios in which we have surveyed the breadth and depth of our laboratory, from life sciences to the physical sciences to computational sciences, and have honed in on what we call technology portfolios and platforms of technology that have applications to commercial marketplaces. We've captured those portfolios and we've assigned P&L, profit and loss expectations to those portfolios. We've said if we have a portfolio of nuclear medicine intellectual property, we want to understand the investments that we're making in that intellectual property juxtaposed against the financial returns that we can expect. And in the world of the business world, we have to make tough choices. That if we have portfolios that aren't performing and that we can't paint scenarios and understanding marketplace opportunities, how they can perform, then we're increasingly foregoing intellectual property rights in portfolios that we don't think are as strong as others. Those are difficult decisions to make. When you tell a researcher that, in fact, we think you've got a great idea and we want to encourage you to continue to produce interesting ideas, but that's not an idea that is worth our investing in the intellectual property opportunities on. We operate with those dollars in mind in my shop. That profit is a good word. We start right there and not being afraid to say to everybody in our organization, we're here to make a profit. We do it increasingly through a mix of deals in the private sector. Those deals can flow with small firms and large firms. Increasingly, we're taking equity stakes in small startup companies. We're taking upfront fees, and then we also take the more traditional royalty approach. The royalty approach is generally the approach that has been taken historically both at this university and at our institution. We think adding a mix to that, where we're willing to take a small piece in a company. Imagine if the Oak Ridge National Lab had the opportunity to take a small piece in CTI when it went public. Take a look at what's happening as Google goes public and Stanford and had small equity stakes in the tens of millions of dollars that's producing for their institutions. And those are the long shots in the business world, the long shots in life, but we're increasingly trying to position ourselves to focus on that best return for the laboratory. We feel it's our responsibility, as you all in the research world are making those discoveries that can change the marketplace, to understand how for the institution that we value from a monetary standpoint those discoveries, that we protect them, and then we best go out and market it to make sure that in a university setting or a laboratory setting in our instance, that there is great value that can be created there. I mentioned that we're dealing with startups and mid-sized companies and large companies. Historically, our approach has been to deal almost exclusively with small startup companies. And while we're going to continue and will continue to support startup companies, I can tell you that starting a company from scratch based on intellectual property that sometimes is very, very early in its ability to move to the marketplace is very, very difficult proposition requiring lots of financial support, lots of management support. We're finding it increasingly important to look at larger companies that already have the financial wherewithal to go out and do our licensing strategy. At the same time, we're providing support to those very small startup companies. Technology 2020, which I helped to start in the early 90s, and Fred serves on the board, has a program called the Center for Entrepreneurial Growth that started in Oak Ridge. And over the last 4 years, we've spun out 43 new companies in this region that have technology that's licensed and or has a relationship with the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. That very same program is now operating on the University of Tennessee campus. And there are opportunities to get, everybody in this room has the opportunity to think about how research that you're doing and ideas that you might have could become private sector companies. And you need to know that that support is available on this campus through the Center for Entrepreneurial Growth. There are visions that Fred and others have of an incubator on this campus to help grow those new companies. And I think all of those are very, very important strategies. I think you've got to layer on top of that the DuPonts and the Eastmans and the General Motors of the world to make sure that we approach things in a diversified manner as we look at licensing. Another slide that I borrowed from MIT, though, talks about how deals really get done. When MIT looks at their deal flow, they find that over half of those deals and the matches for the licenses that they find come from the research staff themselves. That suggests to me in Oak Ridge that we've got to do a much better job of cultivating our research staff's relationships back into our office so that we can best understand the various relationships and linkages that they have with the private sector. We're wonderful in putting out websites with lists of intellectual property that are listed on those. And I'm telling you that in the business world of licensing technology, it's not about lists. It's about being a contact player in a contact sport. It's all about relationships. And what's interesting to me is about this linkage that MIT has found of its graduates as they go out into the business world and of their faculty that are on staff. A fascinating statistic at MIT is that 80% of the faculty at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology have ownership and or a consulting agreement with an outside firm located generally regionally there in the Boston area. Now that's a scary proposition for many provosts at universities around the country to think about 80% of their faculty having ownership in companies that might have some relationship back with the university. That means you've got to manage conflict of interest very cautiously and very diligently, but I think that MIT has proven that you can do that and that entrepreneurialism can live not only right next door to or side by side the research staff, it can be a part of the research staff. Our philosophy is to prioritize those opportunities. I've mentioned the making of tough choices. We do that by strong legal analysis. We've got in-house attorneys that we work with. We've got outside counsel that we go to on specialized opportunities to review invention disclosures and help us pass legal judgment on those. We do a great technical analysis. You would expect us to be world-class, and we are. We're the Oak Ridge National Lab, world leaders in so many areas of science and technology. The area, however, that has been weak in our system has been the market analysis. It is a new concept for us to begin to bring the business department, and we're partnered with the MBA program here at the University of Tennessee, to bring them in as a discussion on the legal analysis and the technical analysis. We're now increasingly bringing a discussion led by the UT MBA program and a lot of outside consultants to help us understand the market analysis before we choose to patent a piece of intellectual property. And that's all about prioritization. Fred and I have had this discussion about the very same challenges here in the university setting of how you bring that know-how. But what I found is I'll take the 4 MBA students that we give 2-year scholarships to and are now actually recruiting around this program, I'll stack them up against, from the University of Tennessee, any resource from a market analysis standpoint anywhere in the country. And it offers all of us an opportunity to better think about cross-pollination, not just to think about the Department of Nuclear Energy as a silo within a university, but to think about the wonderful resources that are across our laboratory, your university, that offer us opportunities to have insight into what marketplaces might think about our technologies. We talk about measuring the right things, and when I got to Oak Ridge 2 years ago, we measured one thing, and that is how many new companies we were creating a year. And I didn't believe that was, I thought it was a good measure, but not a comprehensive measure for how you do technology transfer. And so we've created what many have affectionately called our circle of life that starts with the concept, or are you creating invention disclosures? Invention disclosures become the lifeblood of technology transfer and commercialization. If you all who are doing benchtop exercises aren't disclosing things to our office on a regular basis, we never have the downstream opportunities to do technology transfer. So what we're doing within our laboratory is, again, trying to practice what we preach and saying it's a contact sport, getting our commercialization staff out into the laboratories, working with that staff to help them understand why the invention disclosure process is so very, very important. We require it as a part of the employment contract. Fred, I don't know if that's a requirement of the university's employment contract or not, but regardless, if you lead something to an employment contract, you're not going to get it. It's got to become a culture, and that's what we're trying to change at the Oak Ridge National Lab. Non-disclosure agreements. Why in the world is a non-disclosure agreement of interest to somebody in the commercialization world? I would suggest it's a great measure of whether or not the private sector thinks you have anything of interest, because if they do, they're going to want to be talking to you in the way they talk to you through NDAs in our system, in the university system. Certainly, patenting is important, not merely the application of patents, but how many patents issue, how many patents you get in terms of a research budget. There are many quantitative ways that you can look at that. Licensing becomes the lifeblood of the legal mechanism of creating value on your intellectual property. That's the legal contract between a private sector that allows them to gain access to patents. Income, and I talked about the mix, not simply royalties, but equity. Do you create the CTIs of the world? That's an important measure and mix that ultimately is very, very important. But if you create those companies, and they aren't in a maturing mode, if they're not growing up to be successful into the future, like CTI is, CTI struggled for many, many early years living off of SBIR grants and trying to figure out different funding models that could help them move forward. And then finally, a year ago, going public. Over a 20-year period of time that occurs, if you're not measuring your licenses and whether or not your technologies are helping companies mature through a company life cycle, and that's exactly what we do with our Center for Entrepreneurial Growth. We have several things that we're trying to do to promote entrepreneurialism. We have entrepreneurial leave at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. It allows a researcher to get the entrepreneurial bug and decide that they're going to risk their job and their financial stability that they might have in the lab and go try a startup company. We backstop them. We help provide them health care coverage for a period of time while they do that. We provide them an ability to come back into the lab if their venture fails. And guess what? In the entrepreneurial world, ventures fail on a regular basis. They fail more often than they succeed, and we're trying to help our staff understand how that's okay, and that if you've got a failure, we're going to provide you a safe haven back in the lab, a place to come back and do research and development. We've created our Center for Entrepreneurial Growth that I mentioned. We had a wonderful one-year experiment with the University of Tennessee called the Technopreneurial Program, which was dubbed Come for a degree and leave with a company. It was an interdisciplinary program of engineering, law, and a business school that brought people together an evening a week for a very intensive program on how to create companies out of intellectual property, led by Lee Martin, who was the founder of the IPIX Corporation based on patents that he had created at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and elsewhere. That experiment and that pilot project led to a number of new companies. It exposed a lot of students to a lot of great ideas. I believe changed a number of students' minds about what they might do in their career. There's one particular company called Protein Discovery, 25-year-old guy that came out of the business school that is as energetic of an entrepreneurial, will be a serial entrepreneur in my estimation, that found the technology in Oak Ridge, licensed that technology with another partner from his class program, and got 2 SBIR programs, has a Phase 3 SBIR proposal out right now, got $1 million of venture capital, and has been on the West Coast over the last 6 weeks trying to raise $8 million of venture capital to continue his protein discovery company, and is a tremendous success story of what can happen with guys and gals just like yourself that get the entrepreneurial bug if we'll provide them the tools. That's a program that a lot of us have discussed ought to be reestablished in some kind of form or format, and I think in the years ahead it will. We do a lot of SBIR support, Small Business Innovation Research Program. It's probably one of the greatest programs for helping researchers figure out how to get funding for new ideas and to do it in a way that in many ways is risk-free money that the federal government provides and actually mandates that their research programs support. We've got an expert on our staff that does regular seminars on helping not only our staff but the community understand how to build SBIR support in their programs. Access to capital is absolutely critical. Without financial investments, small startup companies can't grow up to be larger companies. We on the Battelle side of the equation have recently created $150 million early stage venture capital fund that is aimed almost exclusively at the laboratories, including the Oak Ridge National Laboratory that Battelle manages and or owns or controls. It's a wonderful opportunity that we've never had before to really begin to deploy real capital against real ideas. It brings us into venture capital relationships that we've never had before. We're trying to approach venture capital in the same way that we approached economic development when I was at the state, from a recruiting standpoint that says you've got to get out, knock on doors, tell your story, and begin to recruit venture capitalists and monies to this region. We have plenty of ideas, but we've always had a dearth of any real organized venture capital, and we're trying very, very hard to change that. Technology 2020, which Fred and I still serve on the board on, have a lot of debt financing tools that are available, and we're in discussions about creating a sidecar venture capital fund with a number of people in this community that have money that they would be willing to invest in venture capital for early stage technology investing. I believe that this venture world is absolutely critical to our understanding long-term how we take advantage of a University of Tennessee and an Oak Ridge National Lab and all the great technology that comes out of it. We're out doing trade shows and brochures and newsletters and a redesigned website trying to be aggressive in how we tell the story about our intellectual property to the world. Much of that is very, very low-tech, but it's all dedicated as it relates to making sure that we're out pounding the pavement on behalf of the National Laboratory, our intellectual property holdings, and how we can solicit preferred partners. We've got a couple of very strategic new initiatives that I'll briefly mention. One is something called privately funded technology transfer. My operation, Fred's operation at the University of Tennessee are funded by government funds, whether it's University of Tennessee funds or, in our instance, Department of Energy funds. Our program is funded by those government funds. We have proposed to the Department of Energy, and they have approved our bringing private corporate dollars to help supplement those government funds in maturing and licensing and protecting our intellectual property at the National Laboratory. We've not done a privately funded tech transfer project yet, but the program works in a manner that after an invention is disclosed, we can make the decision to move it into the private side of our financial ledger, bring corporate monies to bear on that intellectual property. Always the question that gets asked is if we hit a home run and make a lot of money, what happens with it? Again, as a not-for-profit, we are always governed by the Bayh-Dole rules and regulations that govern federally funded intellectual property, and so that doesn't change, but it allows us a source to bring additional private capital to the world. We are proposing to the Department of Energy something called a use permit that would allow us to, as UT Patel Corporation, the ability to contract directly with Eastman Chemical Company or General Motors or DuPont or any other private entity to private entity, and use the facilities and people at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory to perform private sector research and development. It is a proposal that has many questions by the Department of Energy, and we've sought to make sure that we have laid out a plan that we can demonstrate to the Department of Energy as a proposal that allows private sector partners to come to the table that can benefit the Department of Energy's government sector activities. The premise that we have is that without robust private sector partnerships at the National Laboratory, we don't get the right market insight, that our researchers don't get the right market insight that is needed. We lost one of the best researchers that we have. I gave out in May, we did a ceremony for royalty checks where we do sharing with inventors. And we did it in a celebration, and we cut one of the lab's largest royalty sharing checks to one of our research staff earlier this year. We handed in that check, and as I handed in the check, I announced to the group that was there, and most all knew it, that he was leaving the Oak Ridge National Laboratory to go to a university in North Carolina. And my question back to the Department of Energy is, do we want to have robust partnerships with the private sector that encourage existing staff who are so inclined to stay with the National Lab that allow us to recruit additional staff in, or do we want to lose them to other research institutions who are more inclined in that way than we are? We think a use permit is right in the center of the solution to breaking down the bureaucracy, the rules and regulations that prevent us from engaging as much as we'd like to with the private sector. I talked about our venture capital strategy. I'll mention just briefly an economic development strategy around the spallation neutron source. All of you know about the SNS, the world's largest science project, $1.4 billion being invested on Chestnut Ridge and Oak Ridge, that will cause and is already causing the world's attention to turn on Oak Ridge as it relates to neutron scattering research and development. The breakthroughs that will come through nanotechnologies and material sciences as the SNS comes online in 2008 are unfathomable to all of us. We know that nanotechnology will change the face of all material science, everything that we touch. We're not sure whether or not that's in the next 10 years or the next 100 years, but the great opportunity is to get to sit next to those opportunities and think about how it can change our East Tennessee community from an economic development standpoint. Who are the vendors? Who are the next nanotech companies that will want to locate because of the proximity to a spallation neutron source? Who are the same companies that might have wanted to locate next to a Manhattan project 60 years ago, but because of secrecy weren't allowed to even know that a Manhattan project was being developed and organized? Our opportunity with the SNS and other major science facilities is to be at the forefront and to partners lockstep and barrel with those that are developing these new science projects for us. So it's an exciting opportunity to roll out strategies that we can do. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for further collaboration within Oak Ridge. Not to give you too many details, but we have things called Y12 and K25 and ORNL, which used to be X10, all different sites in Oak Ridge that could benefit from greater collaboration. I think the collaboration between we at the National Laboratory and this university only offers tremendous opportunity, and that's why I put the UT Research Foundation there, where we can coordinate our economic development activities, where we can leverage the support of our community. We have amazing political support in Washington, D.C. It can be support that yields great benefit for the university and for Oak Ridge if we're coordinated, or it can be great political support that isn't maximized if we approach things in an uncoordinated manner. That means being very coordinated with folks like Bill Haslam and Mike Ragsdale, the mayor of Knoxville and Knox County, Phil Bredesen, our governor, and everybody in between as we think about what our strategies for Oak Ridge would look like. So that is a quick overview of technology transfer at the National Laboratory, why we think it's important. I'd love to stop now and entertain questions in a dialogue, let you challenge me in this concept of whether or not the private marketplace ought to be standing shoulder to shoulder in a research laboratory. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What are your visions on publishing versus patenting and anything else that might be on your mind? So I'll open it up for questions.
Questions and comments?
Yes.
I'll create a hypothetical situation. Suppose Lee Dodds, an outstanding university professor here, he's working under contract for right. He's working on a contract, the subcontract with Oak Ridge National Lab, and it's funded by the Department of Energy, and he discovers how to split water into oxygen and hydrogen in his basement on the weekend. Now, how does that pie get divvied up?
Well, it's a great question that Fred Tompkins and I have been having some discussions over the last year, not as well as I think either one of us would think that it should be done.
But one comment, I guess one concept is that all wealth is generated by new ideas,
right.
Creative thinking. So how much goes to Lee Dodds versus how much goes to the government, the UT, and Oak Ridge National Lab?
So fundamental premise in our technology transfer program and any other technology transfer program in the country is that first, Lee Dodds needs to participate in the financial gains under that scenario.
10%, 20%, 1%?
In our instance, it's 15% off the top. In the University of Tennessee's instance, it's 50% off of the bottom. Now, what's the difference? The top is we give 15% before we take any expenses for running our program. So before we pay my salary, before we pay for patenting costs, et cetera, we give 15% right off the top. What the University of Tennessee does is give 50% off the bottom, and so they take off all the expenses of running the Office of Technology Transfer or the Research Foundation in this instance, and then they give 50% of it. And, you have to run the numbers on any particular approach. I believe that it makes sense for the university and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory to get as close as possible as it can in its approach to how to deal with that issue. Because we shouldn't care whether Lee Dodds is a University of Tennessee employee, an Oak Ridge National Laboratory employee, a contractor or a subcontractor or whatever the case is. We want his knowledge creating ideas. We want him to be motivated financially. We don't want him to have one incentive program with the University of Tennessee and a different program that might be a disincentive or more of an incentive at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. We need a collaborative program, and that's one of the things that Fred and I have been talking with. But the fundamental premise that I think we both agree on is that Lee Dodds, the researcher in your example, needs to financially participate significantly because they're the source of that intellectual knowledge and know-how. Now, I don't care in the Oak Ridge National Laboratory Our employment contract would suggest that, knowledge that is derived while you're sleeping at night and you wake up in the middle of the night and write it down on your bedside table is no different than knowledge that's derived when you're working in one of our laboratories. And so when you come on the staff at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, you agree willingly that the intellectual property that you develop as our staff member is free and open for the laboratory under the recognition that you're going to participate.
Another slight thing. I ran a situation a couple of years ago at Oak Ridge where they did not want to hire a student to work on a particular project because there's a law that gives students the first claim to any intellectual property. What's the deal with that?
Well, just as any visiting staff member or visiting researcher on our staff can come in and do research on our campus collaboratively, we have to have agreements that govern that, and students fall right into the middle of that. That's why we've got to get very close as the University of Tennessee and ORL in our policies so that students' rights are the same on our campus as they would be at the University of Tennessee campus, and we don't have a disincentive system that are moving back and forth. I'll be real candid with you. We have researchers who on both sides of the equation aren't as interested for intellectual property reasons as they might otherwise be, students who aren't as interested because we have systems that are very far apart. Our challenge and our mandate should be to bring them as close together so that there's, people movement back and forth without those disincentives.
Let me ask a question. Since you represent UT Battelle, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, can you give us a good example of an intellectual property that's been developed at the lab, it's been commercialized, generated a big profit, and has been brought back further and to reinvest into the lab?
Oh, yeah, sure. Our largest royalty payment this year, which is a six-figure nearing, in this particular year, it could near seven figures, is based on a micro cantilever technology that through microfluidics technology that allows micro channels to move, in this instance, blood particles around to do instant diagnostics on what we call lab on a chip. That microfluidics technology, the ability to move fluids around in micro channels, was licensed to a company called Caliber Systems in California. Caliber then commercialized it into their lab on a chip technology that they sell, and that's been a huge then generator back into the laboratory that we reinvest. Now that's on the nice big success side of the equation. The majority of things that we do are less than $100,000, and we have a lot of things that haven't yet produced income. Many universities have had great successes in drug discoveries, in which you can look at the Taxol drug down in Florida that's produced, some $60 or $70 million on an annual basis for Florida-based institutions. We have less opportunities in that world. The university with the Health Sciences Center in Memphis, though, has got some great plays. Quite frankly, a company that went public this year that has lots of promise.
You have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. When we negotiate a contract with a client these days, if there's a desire on the client's side to control intellectual property, we don't have a mechanism clearly defined for assigning a cost to the additional burden of controlling the property. And I suggested that we had at Rensselaer, I worked for SCO and Center for Manufacturing Productivity and Technology Transfer, we had a scaled overhead structure that scaled additional overhead with additional intellectual property controls. Can we think about ways to do that here if we're going to routinely control intellectual property?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And if you want a use permit, one of the reasons you want a use permit is to do more of that type of work. And so then on the front end, you've got to be defining. Case in point would be you do work for a private sector company, and that private sector company wants to control your intellectual property. You need to do a couple of things. You need to value what that intellectual property value might be, and now you're valuing something that you don't even know what is. And so you've got to, in the negotiation process, be savvy enough to begin to think in those terms. What we do at the lab, in terms specifically to your question, is we require direct reimbursement that is fully burdened in our system by the company of all of our intellectual property costs. And so if there are patenting costs, if there are protection costs, market analysis costs, we fully burden that, meaning we apply our full overhead to it and then charge it directly back out of the contract to the company.
Peter.
Yeah, suppose you may aware of maybe Fred or you, there's a NSL Engineering Research Center, really want to commercialize the technology. So we have to prepare the proposal. And do you provide support to prepare this proposal? There's a very distinct item called technology transfer, industrial collaboration. Maybe there's something you're doing can help us to put the proposal together.
We do. We provide on a routine basis staff that are available to help write the commercialization plan in the proposals that you're referencing, whether it's NIH, NSF, in some instances Department of Commerce that we've been very engaged in, writing the language that having the right staff that understands how to write the right commercialization language that go into those proposals. So we, on a routine basis, get engaged by OR&L staff to help on those fronts. And I would tell you, everything that I've been saying, as far as I'm concerned, is applicable to the University of Tennessee. I mean, Fred and I have got an open door between the two of us. If we have staff that you're ever working on a proposal that we can help bring to bear and helping to enhance that proposal by writing a commercialization plan that gets put as a part of it, we're more than willing to do that.
One more question from the back.
The question as a planner, as opposed to a technologist, is there anything that's attractive to entrepreneurs in the rural communities in Tennessee? And now the question is, what can they do to make themselves more attractive to players?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great challenge. I mean, my career and heart lies in that very arena. In how do you help rural areas understand where the opportunities are? In some ways, the Oak Ridges and Knoxvilles of the United States and of the world are going to be just fine economically because they're sophisticated enough to have the right players that are there. One of the things our Center for Entrepreneurial Growth does is try to say to somebody in Claiborne County or Morgan County, we can help teach you. I don't believe you teach somebody how to become an entrepreneur, but we can help cultivate that entrepreneurial spirit that's inbred in people, help teach you the tools of the trade in a very intense way that provide that support. There are lots of incubators around that are cheap space. I think that historically those have been failures. I think that what rural communities have to think about doing is how to partner with urban areas so that we take business expertise and we teach and take that expertise and teach it to those in rural areas that wouldn't otherwise have it. Case in point, we have two of the biggest entrepreneurs anywhere in the country in this community, Jim Haslam and Jim Clayton, respectively have built two of the biggest empires, one in mobile homes and one in truck stops and gas stations. On the one hand, neither of those individuals is particularly technology savvy, except for the fact that Jim Clayton is actually an engineer and actually is very technology savvy, but his company, in some manners, is not much of a technology company. Those two individuals and the knowledge that they have as entrepreneurs is what you have to figure out how you capture that understanding and how you push it out and teach it to people that are in rural areas of the state or other areas quite here in the urban factor. So you've got to begin to identify those people who have unique entrepreneurial talents and then begin to understand how you transfer those talents. It's not technology transfer, but it's certainly knowledge transfer. How do you transfer the knowledge of Jim Clayton and Jim Haslam's business experiences to help build business experiences that can yield new entrepreneurs, whether they're rural or urban settings.
Okay. We do have a few new faces in the audience, as we have every week, and I should remind you that we have a reception after this presentation, and Alex will be down there. We have refreshments, and you have the opportunity to ask more questions and engage in one-on-one conversation with him. But before we adjourn, let's express our appreciation to Alex for his final. Very good. Downstairs. Ronnie? Take Alex downstairs and get him. That's why I do that, is to get him.
Well, I'm well. How are you?